Go anytime you want. It's going.
Hi, my name is Doug Paterson. I am a teacher, a former teacher, and an emeritus professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha in theater. My major focus was theater and social justice. And in fact, social justice has sort of been my social and economic justice and political justice has been my focus for over 50 years. And now as I'm in my mid-70s and moving up, I thought maybe I would share a couple of ideas that I have about what we are facing in the struggles for national and global justice. I want to thank my wife, my dear wife Margie, who is sitting behind the camera here, and which is there she is. She's helping to film this. We clearly don't want to make this a high production event. We're looking to make this a neighborhood event. And in fact, the region of Omaha, Nebraska, and the nation and the world are, in one sense, a neighborhood. Certainly because we're all breathing the same air and drinking the same water, living on the same planet, and facing the same extinction. So these are thoughts that I thought I'd share under sort of a title of Doug's Dialogues, which would mean you can contact me. And maybe we can have a dialogue. I have been influenced strongly by the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire and by his compatriot Augusto Boal in the Theater of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Boal's Theater of the Oppressed. And one of their central metaphors is that what human beings really need and desire and crave is dialogue. And what we don't like at all is monologue. So what's kind of interesting about this project is that it's like a lot in the United States, a monologue. But I'd like it to be a dialogue. If anybody has something to say in response to my observations, I would be more than happy to respond, and maybe we get something larger going. Anyway, so what I'm trying to do here in this first sort of presentation is to identify what I think are some key elements of our current national global status and how we got there. So I'm going to have to go back a long ways. And I know this is a bit of a sort of academic history to a certain extent, but it's really human history. And we're humans, and we have gotten to where we are today because of activities and actions centuries and millennia ago. As many of you know, the human animal, the human being emerged out of a lot of other pre-humans out of Africa 2 million years ago, coming from Africa and some of the developed activities that had happened in the area we now call Egypt into the Middle East. But there was still a lot to happen there, and anthropologists and historians and whatever have divided these areas up into the Stone Age and then the Iron Age and the Steel Age or something like that. The Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Sorry about that. And that's all very well and good. What I think we need to talk about is the process of urbanization. Now we can see that towns are beginning to spring up in the area of Egypt, what became Egypt, and the Middle East. Even there's some conjecture that the town of Jericho comes into play about 9,000 years before the Common Era. Here I use the before the Common Era rather than BC, before Christ, just a more sort of secular version of our time. So Jericho comes into being, and then as the human population moves, because it is mobile, it is hunter-gatherers, but it is also beginning to get the abilities to do agriculture. It is moving slowly into the Middle East and into what becomes Iraq and Iran. And across from there, east of there, into what we call Sumeria. And what I'm interested in is that period in Sumeria of about 6,000 years ago, 4,000 years before the Common Era. The rapid development of urbanization. Now we do see towns and villages, of course, that have sprung up all along the way for thousands of years. And it's important to have a distinction between villages and urban centers. Villages retained a great deal of what tribes had. There were, close bloodlines. People knew each other. There was division of labor. There was shared. A lot of cooperative living, even in the early villages. And then as we get to Sumeria and 6,000 years ago, we get some rapid development of urban areas. Urban areas come together. I think almost any discussion of urbanization will say that it really picked up speed with the event that we call civilization. So I'm not going to be a cheerleader for civilization. I do, however, understand that it happened and we're living in the midst of it. So it doesn't help to denounce the entire movement, but some things happened in civilization and urbanization that we're still dealing with and that are serious problems. One of the things that happens with urbanization as tribes and whatever are moving together and organizing, as we get into tribes, we have the emergence of class. I'm almost a sort of a Marxist. I am a Marxist, but that sense of when we begin to get class organized by various levels of privilege and what I call supremacy, we're going to have a state. We're going to have to find some organization that will be able to mediate the conflict between the haves and the have-nots, or those who have power and those who don't have power, or have less power, or the whole gradation of power. And it's with civilization that this happens. Rapid, massive urbanization, and urbanization that is characterized not only by class, and the first emergence really for the human of class on the planet, but we have patriarchy. Many tribes up to this time, the human being had been living in tribes for 40, 50,000 years up to this time. And many tribes, not all, but many tribes were matriarchal. That is, they saw the sort of the continuance of the family and the tribe through the woman for obvious reasons, because of birth and whatever, and giving birth to the future. And women played a key role in the tribes. In fact, I would digress here and say that as we talk about how the human being emerges on the planet from the pre-human, we're pretty tied to the notion of tools. That when humans develop tools, then they're going to become human. Well, that to me sounds too much like too male, too patriarchal, and too much like, what have I got out in my garage? What tools do I have out there? I'm gonna make things. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's a patriarchal look at the way humans emerged, and I'd like to turn to the women, because so many cultures and so many tribal systems were built on women. And I'd like to offer this, is the possibility that the first emergence of that self-awareness, which is a key element of being a human. The tool maker folks would say, it's being aware of a tool in yourself is separate, and therefore you can you wield it and do things like in 2001, A Space Odyssey, and beat up pieces of wood. But with women, it's a matter of this is the process of sustaining the tribe, sustaining life, giving birth. And I would say that this process of self-realization, of being aware of self, comes from women, and it comes from breath. And that women were the ones who were giving the birth, and the men were not. And women had to develop processes of giving birth. And one of the things we know now, we have known for a long time, is that breathing is a key part of giving birth. And we have to imagine other pre-human and emerging human women were aware of other women giving birth, and aware that breath was a part of it. And there was a difference between breathing and breath. that breathing happened all the time, automatically. It kept the human being alive, like the heartbeat. But breath, being able to control that breath, to be able to give birth, really intimate human activities, would position women, I think, as the consciousness that is understanding a difference between breathing and breath, and that humans can, and women humans can manipulate the breath and change the breath in order to facilitate birth. So that's a bit of a digression, but I think it's important because so many of the global tribes, certainly those in the area I'm in Omaha and in North America, had retained a strong matriarchal sort of base up until 18th, 19th century, when European invasions beat it out of them. Well, they tried. They haven't succeeded. So we have this emergence of patriarchy along with class in urban centers, in the Middle East. It is interesting that we also have at the same time, historically, at the same time as we get civilization, which I think is an urban phenomenon, we get slavery, the enslavement of other human beings. So we have to sort of say, what is it about civilization that is supposed to be this great thing that we're all saying we're civilized and they're not civilized or whatever? What is it about civilization that enabled the development of enslavement? I think that's something that's got to be accounted for. Well, what I think it is supremacies. It's what happened inside of urban centers was patriarchal, anti-matriarchal class systems built on force and violence. That men became the ones who, by this time in the Iron Age, are able to make weapons, hold weapons, use weapons, and we end up having patriarchal religions that are built around male versions of gods. And within a very short period of time, we begin to get some really serious wars. Wars between cities and between cultures, between languages, because I would say of supremacies. One of the features of supremacies is that people see themselves as superior to others. So one of the elements that happens is that men see themselves superior to women, that privileged and wealthy men see themselves as privileged over others, and that people who are military-based and violence-based are superior over others, and these humans with these qualities are superior to the next town over. It's so interesting. One of the first things you see with urbanization is the building of not just walls, but defensive walls, as if that comes along with it. In order to stay alive, all the developments that are happening are turning into, fortresses and wars. And the wars are precipitate from 4,000 years before the Common Era, and up certainly into the period of Babylonia and Egypt and, goodness sake, Greece and Rome, which is just massive killing on a massive scale. And I suggest that it's built on those qualities of supremacy. Moreover, and this is a controversial assertion, but I'm not going to be averse to controversy here. What happens when you have supremacies that are put in place, installed, and maintained through force and violence, and the threat of force and violence, you have fascism. And I think that's what happens with civilization. Early stages of fascism. The establishment of privileged rule, of male rule, of language and education rule, of military rule, and these forms of dominance, in which there is not dialogue, there's only monologue, mean that what we're building is a network of power structures that are early stage fascism. I mean, in fact, I think it's probably 4 or 5 different stages of fascism, but I do think that we're soaked in it up to now. And you just didn't see this in primitive tribes, or not probably very advanced tribes. People who lived in tribal structures, matriarchal structures often, did not have supremacies that are put in place through force and violence and maintained through force and violence. There are a lot of customs that happened with tribal peoples that had to do with imitation of conquest or imitation of play or actual play that had to do with dominance or winning or whatever. But we don't have it remotely on the scales. It happened in the urban center because it couldn't have happened without an urban center. It was the urban development that brings about civilization and its fascism. So this process of competition between cultures and cities, in the early stages of cities, there aren't any nations yet, as we define nations today. But there's certain huge spheres of influence where armies are meeting and dominating each other. And there's also a massive absence of women. The theories about what women are doing, that they say agriculture is such a great thing because it freed women. No, I'll probably put women into even more of a slave position. Because one of the things that had to happen when you have a city is that city, for the most part, like our cities today, don't grow food and don't have the basics for nourishing life. And so it has to happen out in the rural areas. And so areas outside of cities in the Middle East, in Sumeria, and in Babylonia, in Egypt, people who live outside the cities had to provide the cities with food. And if that didn't happen, there would be some violence that would come down if the urban needs were not met. If the people in the rural areas, the rural folks, weren't providing agriculture, then they would be made to provide it. And one of the ways to make that happen is through enslavement, of course. So this process of developing highly stratified societies through class and through patriarchy, male dominance, saturated male dominance, and violence and force is a way to gain power and maintain power, bleeds all the way into, of course, the time that we're normally taught in our Western civilization classes, when we get to a few mentions of Egypt, highly stratified society, in which there were a couple of women who actually had a position, to Greece, where women were not allowed to do much of anything. The great democratic state of Greece wasn't democratic. It was a way for the privileged Greek educated property-owning men to engineer power for themselves. So all their grand democracy did not include the unproperty, did not include women, did not include foreigners. It was an exclusive democracy meant to sustain the privilege of the few. So what's interesting is that in that regard is that when Athens finally gets its sort of its election system going, and you have representatives going to the central government, 6% of the vote of the people could vote. 6% could vote, because women couldn't vote. They're about half the population, and foreigners couldn't vote. Enslaved people couldn't vote. There were a lot of those. If you weren't propertied as a male, you couldn't vote. So 6%. And the irony there is that that's exactly the number of people who could vote in the United States in 1790. After our Constitution is finished and the states are finished with theirs, 6% of the population could vote, exactly like Greece. Men could vote, not women. Enslaved people couldn't vote. Foreigners couldn't vote. Women, of course, couldn't vote. Unpropertied men couldn't vote. So it was propertied, rich, privileged, white men. And we set up a democracy like Greece's, in which the minority drew up its Declaration of Independence and its Constitution, and we're living under that to this day, which is a problem. So this movement toward dominance through fascism, through violence, force and violence, is very visible in Rome, one of the most violent societies in the history of the world. It was built on very narrow structures of class, of ruling class, a governmental class, a privileged class, of military, which is a class all by itself, and then 80% of the population or more was just sort of on subsistence. You had to figure out how you could get to live in Rome and the outside areas. And in order to maintain that, there were breathtaking exhibitions of violence, and to sort of normalize violence as a way to compose a society. And a problem with all of this is that Rome became a model for Europe, for the Western, so-called Western traditions, which is, I think, as you get to Rome, it's like a level 2 fascism, okay, to level 3 fascism. They did some horrible things to tribes up in the European area, what Caesar called Gaul. Did some horrible things to tribal systems. So what we've done is advanced the ability of force and violence to maintain privilege. And Rome, as a republic and as a really violent empire, lasts for 700 years, and finally, just for any number of reasons, collapses on itself. The Christian Church has sort of won the franchise, adopts a lot of Roman governmental structures for how to put together a church, and becomes the dominant force. And then we move on into the sort of the re-urbanization of Europe, because once Rome falls, then Europe goes back to a very sort of a pre-urban rural existence, and new towns form, built around what I would suggest are thugs, who were eventually called kings and queens, but who were able to mobilize a lot of force and a lot of power, and establish themselves as privileged. And this happens from 800, 900 of the Common Era. And by 1000, we're pretty much moving into a re-urbanization of Europe. What's important about this is about this time, about 1200 of the Common Era, cities are really moving, a lot of the cities, and there's a sense in which, because the castles in which the kings and queens are living need the outlying areas. They need the grains and the animals and the cloth and the whatever from rural areas, just like in the past. People have to bring their materials. They have to bring their animals, their cloth, their grains, their beans, their vegetables from the rural areas to the urban area, to the castle. And what happens over a period of 200, 300, 400 years is that outside the castle develops a whole new group of people who are called the townies. They have the town around the castle, and what they become is what France calls the town. The word for town in France is the bouge, or the bourg. In Germany it's the burg, in the French it's the bourg. And these become the bourgeoisie, what we call the bourgeoisie, the traders, the people who understand trading and economics. And by 1200, they've developed banking systems. They've got banks established. And so we are moving into a period of a new class in which Marxists and Leninists will say these classes are going to fight against each other. This emerging class of bourgeoisie, which cannot rule because it doesn't have the blue blood of the aristocracy. Who knows where that came from? There's going to be some real tension. There's going to be some real serious tension. And we have, by that time, it takes 400 years, but it takes a bad turn for the aristocracy in 1642 in England, when the Puritans, who were a very bourgeois religious force, not able to be aristocratic and very hostile to the aristocracy, has a revolution in England and throws out the aristocracy, throws out the king, and that's King Charles I, and cut his head off 7 or 8 years later. And the Puritans rule. Puritans rule from 1642 to 1660 and are very, very nasty to the Irish. Very nasty. And here I think we can see a sort of a level 3 fascism coming into place with English nationalism, puritanical nationalism. But it doesn't last, and the bourgeois Puritans are overthrown in 1660, but the power of the king in England and eventually throughout Europe is eventually broken, and the bourgeoisie, the non-aristocratic but the skilled and the artisans and the manufacturers and the bankers begin to build a new society that will become the bourgeois society. So by 1700 in the 18th century, we have revolutions galore. We have one in the United States. It's a bourgeois revolution. Washington, Adams, Jefferson are the U.S. bourgeoisie. And they throw out the king, and they establish a bourgeois democracy. Limited, 6% voting, a very bourgeois democracy, which maintains enslavement. Wasn't so good for a Christian country to do that, but Christianity had done that all along. And we have the French, so that's 1776 and 1789. The French Revolution cripples the aristocracy with the bourgeois revolution, and by the 19th century, bourgeois systems of government and capitalism are firmly entrenched. And we have the establishment through force and violence of the bourgeoisie and their capitalism as the dominant power in Europe and eventually around the world. And especially when incidents of globalism happen, and capitalism will permeate all societies in the world, which is where we are right now. What I want to emphasize here as I bring this to a close is that the struggles we're having right now in terms of class and patriarchy, privilege, and various forms of supremacy, U.S. supremacy or Chinese supremacy or whatever, are forces that we have to work against. And we have to do that by establishing non-supremacies. Men need to acknowledge that we are swimming in a patriarchy, and to resist that and to move toward collaboration, cooperation, and away from competition. Same thing with the white culture, which has been just relentlessly racist for 4, 5, 6, 7, 800 years, 900 years, and build up with other, I think, really good movements, indigenous people, women, Latinx movements in the United States, African American, of course, to build collaborative cultures, acknowledging that it's very difficult because we are swimming in it. We're swimming in forms of fascism, dominance through force and violence, like police. Police are force and violence, and they establish systems of control over cities to protect white male rich property. That's what it's for. That's what police are for. So therefore, when you have that much wealth, when you have, whatever it is, 6 rich white guys worth more than half the United States, or 80-90% of the wealth of the United States controlled by 1% of the population, you're going to have a lot of people left out. You have a lot of poverty. When you've extracted that much wealth from the population, you're going to need police forces to go into those neighborhoods, those black and brown neighborhoods and the poor white neighborhoods, and break some heads and put some people in jail who aren't satisfied with their lot in life. So this is my first dialogue to talk about civilization, where it starts, the emergence of the human, perhaps, as women, the establishment of urban cultures as centers of dominance through force and violence, the establishment of patriarchy through force and violence, and that these forces are still with us, and so that if we get discouraged, but oh my gosh, why haven't we gotten rid of capitalism? Why haven't we gotten rid of war? Why haven't we gotten rid of the incredible racism? But it's historically deep in our culture. But more remarkable things have happened. We're certainly going to have some forms of revolution to survive the climate crisis, climate change. Some big things would have to happen in the next 10 years, 15 years. So we can use this time to form collaborations in our neighborhoods, in our local areas. Certainly urban agriculture is a wonderful idea. Let's help the city produce its own food. Margie and I produce a modest amount of food here in the way of vegetables. Tomatoes and beans and some occasional cucumbers and a little bit of lettuce we've just run out of. So we want to be part of a collaborative process. And besides collaborative living, we think it's just a lot more healthy and fun for the human spirit. Hey, listen, thanks. If you listened this far, I'm really appreciative. Margie's saying, yeah, whoever, there she is. Thanks again to Margie. And contact me through Facebook. It's Doug Paterson, Paterson with one T. Paterson with one T. It's a Scottish spelling. We had some antagonisms apparently with the English. Can't imagine that happening. So Doug Paterson on Facebook. Send me a message, friend me. We'll do some dialogue. Otherwise, I'm just talking to the camera. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again next time on Doug's Dialogues. See ya.
Beautiful, baby.